Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening.
Officer, on what grounds? The detector didn't alert. Explain the cause.
It's a random check. Cooperate.
Then state the policy you're following on camera.
The alarm hadn't even finished beeping when Judge Elijah Williams realized something was terribly wrong. He stood in the airport security line, dressed in his Navy suit, briefcase in hand, perfectly calm. Around him, travelers moved quietly, unaware of the drama about to unfold. 3 officers approached him, expressions rigid, eyes trained on him in a way that made his blood run cold. They didn't know it yet, but they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Before we continue, I want to ask you, where are you watching from right now? And if you want to see how this story unfolds, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single moment. Elijah Williams, 52, had been a federal judge for 15 years. His courtroom was legendary. Defense lawyers respected him, prosecutors feared him, and criminals dreaded facing him. He was fair but strict, and he had built his reputation on being thorough and uncompromising. In all his years on the bench, he had never needed to raise his voice to control a situation. His presence alone commanded respect. That Tuesday morning in November, Judge Williams had an early flight to a judicial conference in another state. The airport was quiet, with only a handful of business travelers rushing through security. Elijah had made this trip dozens of times before. He knew the routine. Shoes off, briefcase in the bin, metal detector, collect belongings. Simple. Everything seemed normal, until Officer Daniel Pierce noticed him. Not for anything he had done, but for who he was. A well-dressed black man traveling alone. Pierce had been working security for 8 years. He considered himself observant, experienced, professional. What he wasn't good at was recognizing bias, or how badly it could influence his decisions. Pierce glanced at his supervisor, a woman named Janet Fields, who had been running that checkpoint for over a decade. She gave him a barely perceptible nod. In their eyes, Elijah Williams was just another black traveler who had drawn their attention. It was a routine they had performed countless times, but this time, they picked the wrong man to target. Williams finished collecting his briefcase and slipping his shoes back on when Pierce stepped toward him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening," Pierce said. Elijah paused. "Officer, on what grounds?" "My metal detector didn't go off. Was there something in my luggage?" His voice was calm, even, but precise. Pierce hesitated. "It's a random check. Please cooperate." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Random? Can you show me the policy on camera?" Pierce looked to Fields, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Without a word, both officers understood they were about to get challenged. Elijah calmly approached Fields. "Good morning. I'm Judge Elijah Williams. I travel frequently. Nothing in my screening seems unusual. Could you explain why I've been singled out?" Fields replied smoothly, "It's random. Everyone goes through additional screening from time to time." Williams scanned the nearby passengers. 6 people had passed through the metal detector moments ago without additional screening. "Interesting," he said quietly. "I noticed they weren't selected. How do you explain that?" Fields stiffened. "Questioning security procedures is suspicious. You need to comply." That was when Elijah's eyes narrowed. Anyone who had seen him in his courtroom would have recognized the look. Calm, measured, but sharp as a knife. This wasn't a man about to be intimidated. This was a man observing every detail, cataloging every violation, preparing for action. "Please tell me your name and badge number," Williams said. Fields gave both reluctantly. "And this conversation," he continued, "is it being recorded?" "Yes," she admitted, a trace of regret in her tone. Pierce returned, holding a handheld wand. Spread your arms and legs. Pat down required. Elijah complied, but he also pulled out his phone and began recording. The moment he did, the power dynamic shifted instantly. Fields snapped. You can't record security procedures. I'm in a public space, and I have the right to document my own interaction with public officials, Williams said evenly. If transparency is an issue, perhaps the procedure should change. Pierce glared, but Elijah's calm persisted. The pat-down found nothing. Pierce then instructed a search of the briefcase. Each item, documents, laptop, pens, a small leather portfolio, was examined carefully. Pierce flipped the portfolio, and her face changed. Elijah's judicial ID stared back at her. The realization hit. They had just been harassing a federal judge. Fields said aloud, for all to hear, "Judicial credentials don't exempt anyone from screening." Her voice was defensive, almost theatrical. Elijah closed his eyes briefly and took a deep breath. Instead of demanding special treatment, he let it continue. He wanted to see how far it would go. He wanted to document every violation. Pierce instructed a deeper search, examining every pocket and electronic device. Elijah's laptop was powered on and browsed. Sensitive court documents were accessed, violating privilege, but Pierce said nothing. The search dragged on for 15 minutes as passengers watched. A pattern was emerging. A black man, professionally dressed, being singled out while others passed freely. Finally, the search ended. Fields handed back his belongings with a non-apology. Elijah packed slowly, deliberately. He requested Fields' supervisor's contact information, incident report forms, and security footage. She gave the information reluctantly, unaware of the storm that was coming. Williams had already identified multiple federal violations: unlawful search, violation of privilege, racial discrimination, abuse of authority. He missed his flight, but he wasn't worried. He spent the next hour calling his assistant, civil rights lawyers, and media contacts. By the time he boarded a later flight, he had compiled a 20-minute video, witness contacts, and detailed notes. Even in the air, Elijah's work continued. He researched Fields and Pierce, uncovering past complaints against them for similar discrimination. Each complaint had been dismissed internally. A systematic pattern was clear, targeting successful black travelers who looked prosperous. By the time his plane landed, Judge Williams had a strategy. This wasn't just a complaint. It was a federal civil rights action waiting to happen. The plane touched down, and Judge Elijah Williams walked through the airport terminal with a quiet focus that belied the storm he was about to unleash. He had already made the necessary calls, to his assistant, to civil rights attorneys, and to federal contacts. Every step he took was deliberate, measured. He wasn't here to chase revenge. He was here to document, expose, and bring accountability. He checked into his hotel, placing his briefcase on the desk. Inside, he had everything he needed: the 20-minute video recording of the encounter, notes detailing each violation, witness contacts, and timestamps of the events. Elijah spent the evening compiling the information, carefully cross-referencing the video with security procedures and federal laws. He pulled up the TSA guidelines on his laptop and highlighted every rule Pierce and Fields had ignored. Every step of the pat-down, every glance at his laptop, every intrusive search. Each violation was meticulously documented. By the next morning, Elijah was ready to act. He contacted the United States Attorney's Office for the district where the airport was located. The assistant who answered his call sounded skeptical at first. "Sir, these incidents are usually handled administratively, not as federal civil rights violations," the voice said. Elijah's tone was calm but firm. "You need to review this carefully. The officers accessed confidential judicial documents, conducted discriminatory searches, and violated multiple federal statutes. This isn't an administrative issue. It's a civil rights violation under color of law. There was a pause on the line, then a change in tone. We'll review the footage immediately. Within hours, FBI agents were reviewing the checkpoint cameras. Field notes, recordings, and internal documents were being examined. The video Elijah recorded was crystal clear. It showed Pierce and Fields conducting searches far more invasive than necessary, targeting him alone while other travelers passed freely. Their expressions and tone revealed bias, frustration, and even malice. Elijah's investigation didn't stop there. He used his network of colleagues, many of whom were black judges, to gather stories of similar experiences. Judge Latasha Monroe from Atlanta recounted how she was stopped every single time she traveled, even with TSA pre-check. Judge Rafael Diaz from Texas told of officers rifling through confidential case files under the pretense of security checks. Judge Simon Hall from Florida explained that invasive pat-downs had become routine, and she often drove to conferences to avoid the humiliation. All of these stories painted a damning picture. This was a pattern, not an isolated incident. Successful Black and Hispanic professionals, judges, doctors, executives, were being singled out purely because they didn't fit the stereotype of a normal traveler. Elijah compiled every account into a detailed report, cross-referenced with the timestamps and evidence he had captured. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Pierce and Fields returned to work, unaware of the storm heading their way. They assumed this incident would be forgotten within days. They had no idea that the black man they harassed was a federal judge with the knowledge, authority, and patience to expose them. Elijah contacted Agent Sarah Chen, an FBI investigator with 15 years of civil rights experience. Within 48 hours, she had uncovered dozens of similar incidents captured on airport cameras. Pierce and Fields weren't just overzealous. They were part of a deliberate pattern of racial profiling. Every time a well-dressed Black or Hispanic passenger appeared, they were singled out for intensive scrutiny. No white travelers received the same treatment. Chen also discovered the internal complaint process was corrupt. Every complaint filed against Pierce or Fields had been dismissed by Tom Bradley, the airport's administrative officer. Bradley had minimized complaints, coached officers on how to write statements to avoid accountability, and rewarded them with positive evaluations. Institutional bias wasn't just present, it was encouraged. Elijah knew that the evidence would be overwhelming. Pierce and Fields had documented communications where they mocked black travelers, calling them uppity or fancy-dressed thugs. These messages weren't isolated. They showed intent. The officers weren't just biased. They were malicious. Before filing any legal action, Elijah decided to confront Fields one last time. He called her office. "Good afternoon, Supervisor Fields. This is Judge Williams. I'd like to request a formal explanation of your actions yesterday. Please provide the names of any witnesses and all incident reports immediately." Fields' voice was sharp. "Judge Williams, I'll wait," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. "Take your time." The intensity of that moment was quiet but electric. Fields knew the legal consequences of the encounter, and she knew that Elijah Williams wasn't someone who could be intimidated. She stammered, "I'll provide the information." By mid-morning, Elijah had everything he needed. He met with civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, who immediately recognized the strength of his case. Together, they planned a federal lawsuit targeting Pierce, Fields, Bradley, and the airport authority itself. The claims included racial discrimination, unlawful search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, and abuse of authority. Elijah wasn't interested in personal gain. He wanted systemic reform. Every detail mattered: the pattern, the witnesses, the video, and the documented violations. Roberts emphasized the importance of the recordings and internal communications. "This is the evidence we rarely get," she said. They can't argue against video, witnesses, and documented racial intent. Over the next few days, Elijah worked tirelessly, preparing depositions and organizing materials. He remained composed in public but relentless in his strategy. The case was now larger than a single incident. It was about dismantling institutional bias within airport security. Pierce and Fields soon realized they were in serious trouble. Media outlets picked up on the story within days, showing the video of the federal judge being harassed while other passengers walked through unbothered. The optics were devastating. A calm, professional black judge, methodically complying, versus officers exhibiting bias, frustration, and incompetence. Airport management released a statement claiming officers followed protocol, but the FBI's evidence painted a very different picture. Pierce and Fields were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. It was the first step, but Elijah knew real change required more than temporary suspension. Meanwhile, Bradley, the administrator responsible for dismissing prior complaints, had no idea the federal government was now watching his actions. The pattern of corruption and deliberate dismissal of complaints was about to be exposed publicly, along with his role in enabling it. Elijah's strategy was methodical. He reached out to journalists known for investigative reporting on civil rights abuses in security and travel. He provided portions of the video and detailed accounts of prior complaints. The media coverage amplified the story nationwide, turning what could have been a forgotten airport incident into a conversation about systemic racial profiling and security nationwide. Passengers who had witnessed the screening came forward voluntarily. Their statements corroborated Elijah's account and added weight to the legal and media pressure. The combination of video, witness testimony, and historical complaints created an unshakable case against Pierce, Fields, and Bradley. By the end of the week, it was clear. The airport had underestimated Elijah Williams. A man who had spent decades ensuring justice in his courtroom was now applying the same meticulous approach to hold a corrupt system accountable. What began as a humiliating encounter in a quiet airport terminal had grown into a federal investigation with consequences that would reverberate far beyond a single terminal. By the second week after the incident, the tension around the airport was palpable. Pierce and Fields had been on administrative leave, but the humiliation and scrutiny had only begun. Elijah Williams' case had attracted the attention of federal prosecutors, civil rights lawyers, and journalists alike. Every day brought new revelations, and the officers had no idea how quickly the walls were closing in. Elijah spent the mornings reviewing evidence, the afternoons coordinating with his attorney Michelle Roberts, and the evenings documenting witness statements. The meticulousness of his approach mirrored the precision he demanded in his courtroom. Nothing could be left to chance. Every conversation, every video timestamp, every detail mattered. The FBI, led by Agent Sarah Chen, had expanded the investigation. She discovered more than 30 incidents over 2 years in which Pierce and Fields had singled out Black or Hispanic travelers for intensive screening, while ignoring clear violations from white travelers. Each case followed a pattern. A well-dressed minority traveler, minimal or no alarm from detectors, and a justification of random selection. The evidence was mounting like an avalanche. Then came the breakthrough. Chen uncovered internal emails that revealed Pierce and Fields discussing how much they enjoyed putting uppity travelers in their place. In another thread, Fields referred to passengers as fancy-dressed thugs who thought they were better than airport security officers. The language was explicit, leaving no room for the airport authority to claim innocence. Meanwhile, Elijah Williams was not content to let this remain an internal federal investigation. He wanted accountability and reform. He reached out to other victims of discriminatory treatment. Lawyers, judges, business executives, all provided similar stories. Elijah compiled these first-hand accounts into a comprehensive dossier. He planned to submit it as evidence in his lawsuit and to share parts with the press to ensure public pressure. One afternoon, Elijah decided to meet with Pierce and Fields directly. He requested a formal deposition. The meeting was tense, professional, but charged with an unspoken undercurrent. Officer Pierce, Elijah began calmly, please explain why I was subjected to additional screening when other passengers passed freely. Your metal detector did not trigger. Was there any valid security concern? Pierce shifted in his chair, uncomfortable under Elijah's steady gaze. It was a random check, sir. Elijah leaned forward slightly. Random. And yet you have emails calling travelers uppity and fancy-dressed thugs. How do you reconcile those statements with your claim of randomness? Pierce stammered, unable to maintain composure. His eyes darted toward Fields, who remained silent but visibly anxious. Elijah continued, his voice steady, almost surgical in precision. You and your supervisor have violated federal protocols, including unlawful search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, and clear racial discrimination. You have no legal basis for your actions. How do you justify them? Fields finally spoke, her voice tight. I was following procedures. I wasn't. I didn't intend. You followed procedures incorrectly, repeatedly, and selectively, Elijah interrupted. Your intent is clear from your communications and actions. And now the federal government is reviewing every incident. Pierce swallowed hard. For the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid. This wasn't a courtroom battle he could manipulate. Elijah Williams wasn't just a judge. He was a strategist who had spent decades studying law and human behavior. Every move Pierce and Fields had made had been anticipated and documented. Outside the deposition room, Agent Chen was reviewing more security footage. She noticed that other officers in the checkpoint rarely, if ever, conducted intrusive searches on white passengers who triggered minor alerts. The contrast was undeniable. Pierce and Fields' actions were intentional, targeted, and discriminatory. Elijah knew this was his leverage. The video recordings, the emails, the witness accounts, and the FBI investigation created a perfect storm. The airport authority could try to spin the narrative, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every moment Pierce and Fields had spent harassing him had become a weapon in his hands. Elijah and Michelle Roberts began preparing the federal lawsuit. The claims were extensive. Racial profiling, unlawful search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, abuse of authority, and systemic failure by the airport authority to prevent discrimination. Every detail from the initial airport encounter was cataloged, annotated, and referenced to federal law. As they worked, news outlets picked up the story. National media ran the video footage repeatedly. Viewers watched a composed, dignified black man, Judge Elijah Williams, being treated like a criminal while others walked by unharmed. Public outrage grew rapidly, and the airport's reputation began to crumble under the scrutiny. Pierce and Fields tried to issue statements through their attorneys, claiming adherence to protocol, but the video and emails made these statements irrelevant. Every lie, every excuse, every defensive comment they made was contradicted by documented evidence. Their credibility collapsed almost instantly. The pressure on the airport authority increased daily. The administrators could no longer ignore systemic issues. The public demanded accountability, and federal oversight intensified. Bradley, who had dismissed prior complaints, was now under investigation for enabling discriminatory behavior and violating civil rights regulations. Elijah remained focused. He coordinated with civil rights organizations to ensure that the lawsuit would bring lasting reform, not just financial compensation. He wanted the system changed so that no traveler would endure what he had experienced. He didn't seek revenge, he sought justice. One day, while reviewing emails and reports, Michelle Roberts turned to him. Elijah, this is more than a lawsuit. This could change airport security nationwide. Elijah nodded. That's the goal. If this ends with just an apology or a settlement, nothing changes. We need transparency, accountability, and oversight. Every passenger deserves the right to travel without fear of discrimination. Meanwhile, Pierce and Fields' personal and professional lives began to unravel. Media scrutiny exposed their history of bias, and the FBI investigation threatened criminal charges for civil rights violations. The realization that their actions had consequences hit them fully. They were no longer protected by internal bureaucracy or superficial defenses. Elijah's approach was methodical. He avoided sensationalism, focusing on clear evidence, precise documentation, and strategic communication with authorities and the press. Every step Pierce and Fields had taken to intimidate or humiliate him had been recorded, and every violation would be leveraged to secure justice. As the federal case developed, it became clear that this was no ordinary lawsuit. Elijah Williams had transformed a personal affront into a systemic challenge against entrenched discrimination. His calm, calculated response demonstrated that courage and preparation could expose even the most deeply embedded biases. Pierce, Fields, and Bradley were facing undeniable evidence of their wrongdoing. Elijah's efforts had turned a humiliating incident in a quiet airport terminal into a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and institutional failure in security. What had begun as a routine flight for a judicial conference had evolved into a pivotal moment in civil rights enforcement. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Federal attorneys, journalists, and civil rights advocates filled the seats, all waiting for the moment Judge Elijah Williams would expose the truth. For months, he had prepared meticulously, gathering evidence, witness statements, and recordings. Every violation by Pierce, Fields, and Bradley had been cataloged. Every email, every text, every video clip was organized and ready to be presented. Elijah stood calmly at the front, his suit impeccable, his presence commanding the room as always. The attorneys for the airport authority, Fields, and Pierce shuffled papers nervously. They had expected the case to be settled quietly, but they had underestimated the resolve and precision of the man they had harassed. "Your Honor," Michelle Roberts said, turning toward Elijah, "are you ready?" "I am," he replied, his voice steady. "Let's proceed." The case began with the video footage from the airport. The camera captured everything. Pierce and Fields singling out Elijah while ignoring other passengers, the pat-down search, and the invasive examination of his briefcase and laptop. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Elijah narrated the events calmly, pointing out each procedural violation. "Notice," he said, "how the metal detector did not trigger. Notice how the officers ignored other travelers who went through the same checkpoint. The screening was not random. It was deliberate. It was based on race." Then came the emails and text messages. Pierce's comment about uppity travelers and Fields' reference to fancy-dressed thugs were read aloud. Even the defense attorneys exchanged uncomfortable glances. These weren't isolated messages. They revealed intent. Discrimination wasn't accidental. It was deliberate and repeated. When it was Pierce's turn to testify, he tried to defend himself. "I was following standard procedures," he said, voice shaky. Elijah looked directly at him. "Standard procedures. Accessing confidential judicial documents without authorization is standard procedure. Targeting a traveler based on their race? Are you serious?" Pierce couldn't answer. Fields fared no better when Michelle Roberts questioned her. "Do you deny these messages are yours?" Roberts asked. Fields hesitated. "No," she admitted. "But." "No buts," Roberts interrupted. "These messages, combined with your actions, demonstrate clear racial profiling and abuse of authority." Bradley's testimony was next. He had been responsible for dismissing prior complaints against both officers. Emails showed he instructed officers to downplay incidents and avoid accountability. "Your system enabled discrimination," Roberts stated. "Isn't that true?" Bradley's shoulders slumped. He had no defense. The courtroom was silent except for the clicking of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. The most intense moment came when Elijah himself testified. Calm, precise, methodical, he recounted every detail of the airport encounter. He described how Fields and Pierce had ignored protocol, violated his privacy, and singled him out because he was black. He highlighted the systematic nature of their behavior, supported by the dozens of incidents Chen and he had documented. "Do you see, Your Honor," he said, addressing the presiding judge, how deeply this pattern of abuse was allowed to continue? How the airport authorities' internal processes failed to protect passengers. The courtroom murmured agreement. Elijah's presentation left no doubt. The harassment wasn't an isolated incident, it was institutionalized. As the evidence piled up, the defense realized the strength of the case. They offered a settlement before the trial concluded. The airport authority agreed to pay $8.5 million and implement sweeping reforms. Pierce, Fields, and Bradley would be fired immediately. Mandatory bias training for all security personnel was required. An independent oversight board would monitor future complaints. Statistical monitoring of search patterns would ensure accountability. Elijah's portion of the settlement was not for personal gain. He donated it to civil rights organizations working on airport security reform. "This is never about money," he explained to the press. "This is about ensuring no one else suffers the way I did." The ripple effects were nationwide. Other travelers who had experienced racial profiling came forward. Civil rights lawyers filed lawsuits using Elijah's case as precedent. Federal agencies used it as a blueprint to audit and reform security procedures at airports across the country. Elijah had transformed a personal humiliation into a nationwide movement for change. Pierce and Fields struggled to rebuild their lives. Pierce eventually worked in a warehouse security role, far below his previous position. Fields left security entirely, taking a retail management job. Bradley faced federal criminal charges for civil rights violations and received an 18-month prison sentence. Their actions had consequences, and the system they had tried to manipulate now held them accountable. Elijah returned to his courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had deepened his understanding of systemic bias and injustice. He incorporated these lessons into his rulings, particularly in cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. His courtroom became not just a place for justice, but a place where the lessons of his own experience informed fairer, more equitable outcomes. For Elijah, the victory wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. A single act of courage, combined with meticulous planning and adherence to the law, had exposed systemic wrongdoing and forced institutional change. Travelers across the country would now be protected in ways they weren't before, and the precedent would deter future misconduct. Even years later, Elijah's case continued to influence policy. Agent Chen's investigative techniques became standard procedure for civil rights inquiries in airports nationwide. Legislators cited the case in discussions about federal oversight, and civil rights groups used it to advocate for broader reforms in travel and security industries. Judge Elijah Williams proved that justice sometimes requires more than the authority of a robe. It requires courage, persistence, and the refusal to accept injustice as normal. Pierce and Fields thought they could intimidate a black man with authority, but instead, they provided him the evidence needed to dismantle their system of discrimination completely. In the end, the story wasn't just about one judge, one airport, or one confrontation. It was about exposing bias, demanding accountability, and ensuring that institutions serve everyone fairly, regardless of race. Elijah Williams' determination ensured that no other traveler would endure what he had faced, and that lesson resonated far beyond the walls of his courtroom or the gates of any airport.